Flourish-Meant is sponsored by Access More.
Do you want to go deeper in your faith even while you're on the go? No matter how busy the season you're in, Access More has a library of faith-based podcasts to help you grow spiritually. With podcasts from Christian thought leaders such as Christine Kane, Lisa Harper, Taryn Wells, and Bob Goff. You can hear podcasts on religion, culture, family, entertainment, and so much more. Access More gives you a safe space to find inspiring conversations about faith. Start listening today at accessmore.com.
Is your digital activity interfering with your spirituality? We're going to talk today about being an analog Christian. I'm your host on Flourish-Meant, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be heard on the Edify app. Today, I have with me Pastor Jay Kim. He is the lead pastor of WestGate Church in the Silicon Valley of California. He is the author of several books, including Analog Christian and Analog Church. Welcome, Jay. I'm so delighted to have you on Flourish-Meant today, and I cannot wait to tackle this topic.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina. It's a joy to be on with you, and really looking forward to our conversation.
So let's kind of start with, what does it mean to be an analog Christian, and why is this topic so important for us to address today?
Yeah, the word analog has some elasticity of meaning. It can mean several things, but when I use the word, I intend to use it in what I think is the most baseline, fundamental understanding of the word. Analog meaning physical, tangible, tactile, in-person, embodied. The closest sort of theological word that comes to mind is the word incarnational, which literally means in the flesh. It's the word we use when we talk about God sending his son Jesus, not as an idea or as, a song or a story, or a tweet, but as a human, as a human child born into this world, to human parents. And so by analog Christian, what I intend to mean is the life of following Jesus, the life of discipleship, formation into Christ-likeness as an embodied, in-person, tactile, physical, incarnational reality. And the reason I think it is so important is, and I think most people will be able to relate to this. We live in an increasingly digital world. We live in an increasingly isolated and disconnected world, in spite of the fact that, the promise of the internet 3 decades ago was that it would interconnect us and bind us together in ways that we'd never been bound together before. The reality is, and the data shows this, we feel more isolated, more disconnected than ever before. So I think it's important for that reason and so many other reasons. But ultimately, I think that the life of following Jesus is a life that is not only best experienced and lived, but also intended to be lived in incarnational, embodied, analog ways.
I think it's interesting that you're in the Silicon Valley and you're talking about being more tactile and less focused on being solely digital. Would you talk to us about why this topic came to you as something of urgency and importance in your life and in the lives of those around you?
Yeah, a lot of people I talk to ask me that question because I understand on the surface, it's a little strange that somebody who has spent most of their life in the Silicon Valley, almost four decades now of my life here in Silicon Valley, and is a pastor, has spent, I've spent the last 20 years of my life serving and leading in the local church right here in the Silicon Valley. And people think it's a little strange that somebody who has lived and served in the sort of tech epicenter of the world would be talking about analog, in a digital world. But if you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, my time here, my life here in Silicon Valley has truly informed so much of why I believe what I believe, because I'm surrounded by men and women who, many of them, most of them, in fact, in our church, spend most of their waking hours working on the stuff that is so ubiquitous in our lives, these technologies that we carry around in our back pockets and in our backpacks. And because of that, it's led me to a series of really interesting and helpful conversations with the people who make the stuff that has, that we find ourselves so entangled and enmeshed in. And it's given me a lot of clarity. It's given me sort of new eyes to see, sort of behind the curtain, some of the ethics and philosophy and approach as to why technology is designed the way it's designed. And then, of course, as a pastor and primarily as a follower of Jesus, I've just wrestled in my own life with how digital technologies, things like social media, how they are beginning to form me and shape me in ways that I actually don't necessarily want to be formed and shaped. And so because of that, the last several years of my life, the last 6-7 years or so, I've given a lot of really focused attention and thought to this conversation. And I think it's an ongoing conversation. And, some people have a misunderstanding. They think that I am completely anti-digital, anti-technology, that I'm arguing for everybody should throw away their phones and laptops and live on a farm and churn their own butter or something. And that's not what I'm arguing for at all. I actually have a deep appreciation for digital technology. I just think we need to put it in its rightful place.
So we are managing the technology and using it as a tool. It's not using us, is kind of what you're going for.
That's exactly right. You said it. Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I think that if we're not intentional, these tools end up using us, and they end up shaping and forming us into their image rather than us responsibly, using the tools for our good and for the good of others and for God's glory. And all those things are possible, but it takes a lot of intentionality and a lot of focus.
So let's talk about some of the practical ways we can recognize the boundaries that we need to set with digital living and technology and social media interaction. How do we know the limits of using technology, and when we've crossed over into technology usurping the role of being our manager and controlling us and kind of tethering us to it so that we can't bear to get away from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the ways to think about it is to consider deeply how these technologies and our use or misuse or abuse, how our potential addictions to these technologies, what it's doing to us as human beings. So rather than simply thinking about the functionality of the technology, I think we need to think deeply about the formational effects and the formational power of these technologies. So an example of that might be when you go on social media. How often, how consistently do you find yourself wrestling and dealing with things like comparison or contempt? How often do you find yourself feeling outrage or hostility, toward people on the other side of the digital divide? And I name those things specifically because they're quite common. I think many of us, if we're honest with ourselves and honest with one another, I think many of us would admit, maybe not all of us, but many of us would admit that, yeah, when I'm scrolling Instagram or when I'm going through my Facebook feed or reading a bunch of tweets, yeah, I do find myself comparing. And if I'm not careful, I've had moments where I find myself feeling real contempt toward these people on the other side of the screen. I do find myself wrapped up in hostility or lulled into the vortex of outrage culture. Yeah, that's true. And if it is true, then we need to take a moment, a deep breath, and ask ourselves, is that the sort of person that God, by his Spirit, longs to form me into? And the answer very quickly becomes no. That's not the sort of person God wants us to become. And so then we have to be honest with ourselves and ask the question, well, is it possible that my entrapment, sort of my enslavement to digital technologies, to social media, is it possible that it's actually forming me into the sort of person I don't really want to become? And more importantly, that God doesn't want me to become. And if that is true, then we have to begin tempering our use of the technology. And there's all sorts of practical ways to do that. A digital Sabbath. For me, I've deleted social media from my phone. So I still have social media accounts, but I have to actually open my laptop to go to them, which makes it far less accessible, far less convenient. It means that I can't just mindlessly, endlessly scroll my Twitter feed when I'm waiting in line at the grocery store or pumping gas at the gas station. So I'm on it far less. And when I go on, I'm very intentional because I have to open my laptop, type in the URL, and then sort of post whatever it is I'm going to post. And so there are all sorts of practical ways to create, healthy principles and boundaries in our lives. But I don't want to be monolithic about it. I just think it begins with an honest assessment of what digital technologies, what social media in particular is doing to us, how it's forming us, and then making adjustments as necessary so that God, by his Spirit, might have room to form us into the people that he's called us to be.
Let's talk about the addictive design behind technology. It is actually engineered to make your brain respond to it the same way the brain would respond to an addictive substance, with the endorphin and dopamine rush that you get when you purchase something, click on something, comment on something, get a like, get a positive response to a post that you've made. And it becomes such a thing that you have to constantly look at it because you're addicted to it. How do you detox from that? How do you recognize when that is a problem? And I think there is a detox necessity if you become someone who's not able to put the phone down or put the screen down for at least a little bit of time.
Yeah, detox is the right word. The writer Cal Newport, he's not a Christian writer, but he's got some fantastic stuff out there. His book, Deep Work, is one that I would highly recommend. Cal Newport talks about implementing a 30-day detox into your life, a 30-day digital detox. So, a lot of people do this with their diet, right? People will do detoxes to like cleanse their internal system. They'll, just drink vegetable juice and clean foods for 30 days as a sort of detox. And I think our souls need the same thing when it comes to digital. So Newport talks about a 30-day detox where there's variations on it, but as much as possible, to try and detach yourself from all digital mediums for 30 days. A paradigm he offers is when you detox, if you have a hard time, for example, with work, getting off of email, ask yourself the question, is there any possible way that I can do what I'm doing here or achieve what I'm trying to achieve here in a non-digital, human, analog way? So for example, yes, email is a reality in our lives, both our professional working lives and our personal lives. But ask yourself the question with every email, is there a way I can do this in person? Like, is there a way that I can walk down the hall to the cubicle and have this conversation face to face? If there is, then do that, and then of course with social media, so much of it is just to alleviate boredom or to seek entertainment or to, stay caught up in the lives of people in our lives. So ask yourself the question, is there a way to do that in a more human way? Instead of scrolling, social media, is there a way that I can keep myself preoccupied or even entertained by reading a book or going on a walk or sharing a meal with a loved one or just sitting alone with my thoughts and a cup of tea or coffee, whatever it might be? Is there a way that I can stay caught up in the lives of those I care about by making a phone call or setting up a coffee date rather than just scrolling social media? So that's one idea. The writer Andy Crouch, who is a friend and has been such an influence on me, he suggests regular rhythms of digital Sabbaths. So 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, 1 week a year. Is there 1 hour a day that you can just completely detach and untether yourself from all things digital, social media, email, text messages, all of that? Is there 1 day a week where you can do that, where you can just spend time with family, friends, go for a hike, share a meal, read a book, spend time in your front yard, whatever it might be? Do something physical, take up a hobby that requires the usage of your hands, do a puzzle, whatever it might be. And then is there 1 week a year? And that sounds really daunting, but it is possible. This past summer, my family and we took 3 weeks of vacation. And the very first week, my wife and I took our 2 young children to Southern California, and we just shut off all digital devices. And for an entire week had no digital. And it was strange at first, but it's so life-giving. Just a couple of days in, you feel like you're breathing clean air, and clean air is one of those things you don't realize how smoggy the air you've been breathing actually is until you breathe clean, fresh air. And it felt a little bit like that, so lots of different approaches, lots of different ways. But I think whatever you do, beginning to implement some practices in our lives that can create, again, clean air, in our souls is so critically important.
I love the idea of clean air in the soul. That's just a beautiful concept. And I'm also thinking, what if, I know there's digital technology platforms and programs and software that you can implement to give you a monitoring system of how much time you're spending on social media and getting distracted. But what if you allowed the Holy Spirit to be that monitor? What if you prayed before you took your few minutes a day that you blocked out to do whatever work you actually have to do on your screen? What if you invited Jesus to come with you into your social media experience and allowed him to be your filtering system for how you saw and responded to everything? What do you think about something like that? Would that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only would it work, I think it's vitally important. And again, beyond just our usage of social media and the internet, I just think that's an important posture to take as a follower of Jesus, to constantly and consistently invite the Spirit of God to lead and to guide us. The late, great Dallas Willard, he wrote this book called Hearing God. And in it, he talks about how so many people would ask him, Dallas, I want to hear God, but he's silent. He never seems to have anything to say. I pray, but he doesn't say anything back. And Dallas had this wonderful response. He said, well, is there any, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said, he would ask the people, well, is there any co-laboring endeavor that God needs to talk to you about? And what he meant by that was, most of us expect God to speak to us in those moments when we really need him to talk specifically. But Dallas's whole premise was prayer is not God as a genie in a bottle where he pops out when we want him to grant us our 3 wishes. Prayer is an ongoing conversational relationship with God as you continually work alongside him, in partner with him as he forms a life in us that is for his glory and for our good, and as he forms a sort of life in us that we can pour out onto the world, this sort of redemptive endeavor that we can partner with God in. And so I think in that way, asking God by his Spirit to speak into everything we do, every moment of life, is so critically important. I think that's a part of what it means to, adhere and say yes to the New Testament calling to pray without ceasing, And I absolutely think that's true. And for me, in particular, when the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians 5 about the fruit of the Spirit, and he gives these beautiful characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. It's fruit because it's a work that the Spirit of God does in us, and it's fruit that he bears in us as we continually and constantly invite him by his Spirit to do that transformative work in us. And so if we want to become people of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, then it's exactly what you're saying, Tina. We need to constantly ask God by his Spirit in every situation, every circumstance, to do the work of forming us, right? To do the work of informing our decision-making, informing our thoughts, so that we might be formed into Christ-likeness, so that we might be formed into the sorts of people who live, truly fruitful lives, which is something that I think all of us long for.
It makes me think of the verse, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And we need that renewing of the mind because there's sort of almost I hate to use the word brainwashing, but there is an influence that the digital technology has very subtly on the patterns of thinking that we have. As you mentioned at the very beginning, is it changing me into someone I don't want to be? And we need that constant process of God being there to renew our minds so that we don't become conformed to the patterns of someone that we don't want to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it is, it is a little bit, I don't want to strike fear in people's hearts. I just want to raise awareness. It is a little frightening to think, oh my gosh, like the design of digital technologies, there is an inherent sort of ethic in the design. But it's true. Many people have watched that Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and it did really well. One of the main voices in that documentary is a man named Tristan Harris, who is a design ethicist. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but essentially he's got this great thought. He says, most of us think that social media, for example, most of us think social media is free. And we think it's free because we open our phones, we go to the app store, we download these apps, and they're free. We don't pay anything, and we create an account, and boom, there we are. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it might be. And so we think, oh my gosh, it's a free product. What a gift. But Tristan Harris makes this point. He says, nothing is free. If it's free to you, what it means is you are the product. Right? You are the product being sold and bought on the marketplace of the internet. And that has proven to be true. You think about the story of Frances Haugen, who was the whistleblower for Facebook. She came out last year or a year or two ago with this incredible sort of really eye-opening and sobering report about how Facebook, and I'm not here to bash Facebook at all, but just, how Facebook is deeply aware of how its design is forming people, and yet it's good for the bottom line. It keeps people engaged, and that's critically important because that is the business model, to keep us scrolling and swiping and clicking. So whatever it takes to keep us scrolling, swiping, and clicking is what most of these social media companies will do. But again, they're not inherently, there isn't necessarily an inherent morality that isn't, malleable. It is malleable. There are ways that we can leverage social media and digital technologies for God's glory and for our good and for the common good. There are ways, but it requires intentionality. And if we are not intentional, then the platforms will do the work for us. And what the platforms intend is to increase the bottom line. And what that means is that we are the products, and we're going to be bought and sold on the marketplace in unique ways. Our information, our data, our proclivities, our aspirational desires, all of those sorts of things. And so, again, if we don't want to be formed by those things, then we need to be thoughtful, intentional, and we need to constantly ask God by his Spirit to lead and guide us.
I think that's true of anything in the world. The world is not designed the same way that the kingdom of God is designed. So we are always going to need to be intentional about being who God wants us to be rather than being of the world. We're in the world.
Yes,
So we need to relate to the world, but we need to not become of the world. And
that's right.
remembering to spend the time and more thought and more intentional processes of personal development on our relationship with God and how he wants to relate to others through us than we do on how to be entertained and manipulated by the systems that are in place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It takes intentionality in all spheres of life, not just our digital engagement, but in all spheres of life. It takes real intentionality. It reminds me of Peter's words in 2 Peter chapter 1, his sort of opening lines. He talks about how God has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him, but it doesn't end with knowledge. He says, so you have to participate in the divine nature, in the shaping of a life. And then 2 times in that first chapter, 2 Peter chapter 1, he has this phrase. He says, make every effort. He says it twice, make every effort. And I think that's what it comes down to. Most people, or at least many people, think that the Christian life simply means saying yes to Jesus, getting our little golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory called heaven when we die, and then we just kind of go about our lives. But in reality, the Christian life, if we want to live it and live it to the full, if we want to experience the transformative power of God's Spirit doing a work in us, we have to participate. We have to make every effort. We have to be intentional. We have to focus our energy and our resources, our time, what we give our thoughts to, our actions. We have to make an effort to lean the entirety of our lives in the direction of what the Spirit of God is doing, and in the direction in which he is guiding and leading us. And that doesn't happen naturally. It happens again with intentionality, with thoughtfulness, with a conviction of decision making. I'm going to live this sort of life and not that sort of life. And I think that's so important, like you said, not just with digital technologies, but in all of life, for sure.
Yes, because you definitely see that in the book of the Acts, in the evidence that you see in the letters of the New Testament, that this is not a new thing, that we are a countercultural mindset when we're Christians in a world that the enemy is trying to pull us away from God through all the things that he
Yes.
has designed in the world around us. So this isn't a new thing. It's just a different way that this is potentially enacted against us. But like you said, it doesn't mean technology is bad. We just need to make sure that it isn't conforming us into something of the world instead of something of God that is representing him through evidence of those litmus test pieces that you mentioned in the fruits of the Spirit of God in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there's a lot of hope in that. We're talking obviously about the digital age, and that's sort of the topic I've wrestled with quite a bit in my writing in recent years and in this next book. But the hope is that God has guided and led his people through all sorts of cultural moments before. It's the power of God and the way the Spirit can change us is a timeless, eternal reality. So we don't need to fear that God is somehow surprised or flummoxed by the digital age. It's not like God is throwing his hands in the air saying, I don't know what to do about this internet. No, God knows, and it's well within his power and capability and willingness to lead and guide us through this. We just need to be willing and open to say, God, guide us through this. Whatever you say goes, whatever direction you want me to go in, that's the direction I'm going to head. And so it's really on us, it's really on us to trust in the love and the grace and the power of God by his Spirit in our lives, to shape us into the people that he's called us to be.
This has been such a fascinating and important conversation. And I know that people are interested to hear more about this. How can people stay connected with you and get a copy of your wonderful books that address this topic in greater depth?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Tina. Yeah, the best place probably is just to go to my website. I have a little website, jkimthinks.com, and there's a little tab there that says books, and everything I've written is all there. This particular conversation, I think a lot of it, these ideas are found in my latest book called Analog Christian, and you can find that anywhere books are sold. And I do hope it's helpful for folks.
Well, I so appreciate you coming on Flourish-Meant today, Jay, and I appreciate all of you listening. I hope that you will access the resources that Jay Kim has to offer. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.